My story really starts from the transition of the military. I spent the first approximately 8 years of my life in the Army as an adult. So from 18 for about the next 8 years I was in the military. I deployed to Iraq several times. I've seen a lot of stuff, but the reality is it was normal, and the hardest part about all of it was just exiting the military and becoming a normal civilian person. To be quite frank with you, it is to this day probably the toughest thing that I've ever had to do because you spend your life as a child and then you join the military and that is your adult life for the first 8 years of it, and next thing you know you're out here with regular everyday citizens and you're away from combat and everything that you know. So the story really starts with transition. My very first job when I got out of the military was Walmart. I worked there for $7.25 an hour. My MOS did not translate to a good civilian job by any means, and I did the only thing I knew that I had to do, which was work. $7.25 an hour was not enough. I was always looking for an opportunity to make more, and I have a small list here of places that I worked during that time, trying to build a foundation of some type. Target, a landscaping job, a delivery job. I was building homes. All of these things were miscellaneous. For a lack of better words, I was dedicating myself to boondoggle things. And for those of you that don't know what boondoggle is, I have the definition written down. I thought it was an interesting choice of words to use. Boondoggle is work or activity that is wasteful or pointless but gives the appearance of having value. Waste money or time on unnecessary or questionable projects. Because at every one of those jobs, that's what I felt like. Everything I did was pretty much pointless, but I wanted to succeed. And I worked harder than anybody around me. And in fact, at Walmart, I got laughed at because I would sweat and I was unloading pallets, probably broke records, to be quite honest with you. But everybody else, they were on their cell phones and you get laughed at for working hard, and that's the truth, at least where I was. At some point, I got an opportunity to do fireproofing insulation. That was a decent paying job, I thought. $16 an hour, which was much better than anything I had as a regular civilian. At the same time, I had a second job where I was pretty much driving a machine. That was $13. So I had two jobs that were decent paying. And I was doing well for the most part. We were starting to build back up financially. We've depleted our savings working those miscellaneous jobs for so long. And at some point during that time, my wife got pregnant with our fourth child. It's really a tough thing to say, but it needs to be said. My wife got pregnant with our fourth child, and everything was normal. She went to all the appointments. They did all the sonar things they do all the checks. And at some point, she was in the delivery room, and things didn't go as planned. That child was born, and everything seemed normal. But the first thing we noticed was that the child wasn't breathing at all. And we have 4 children now, so at that time, we had already had 3, and we know that's not okay, and that's not normal. And we were very alarmed. We were going through this for what seemed like 3 minutes of a child not breathing air. And it seemed like 3 minutes. I don't know exactly how long it was. But at some point, all these alarms started going off, and people entered the room, and they got the child to breathe, and we thought, whew, thank goodness, this is okay. And next thing we know, it's fairly normal for many of you that have children. You'll know that when you have a baby, typically, they like to take the child away for a few hours at least so the mother can rest. This to us was normal. However, in this case, that child didn't come back. They had really, without telling us anything at all, they had begun the process to fly that child to the Children Levine's Hospital in Charlotte, which at the time, this whole thing was in Charlotte. So at some point, they let us know that instead of getting our child back, it's of the uppermost importance that you sign these papers because that child is ready to fly now. And the long story short, this child happened to have a heart defect. It's called TAPVAR. It's basically where the plumbing in the heart is not done correctly, and the blood flow is not going where it's supposed to. Inevitably, this child was 1 day old and requiring surgery, or this child will die. And the doctors were pretty specific. They like to wait until the children are at least 6 months old if they can, no matter what happens. As long as they can survive 6 months, they prefer to wait because the death toll is much less at a higher age. Well, this was pretty much a 5-month escapade of surgeries, heart surgeries, and a lot of other complications and problems, at which time I still had to maintain my 2 good-paying jobs because we were just starting to get some type of foundation as transitioning out of the military after so many years. I ended up losing both of those jobs during that time for the same reason, a reason that you probably wouldn't think of now. My wife was calling me 100 or 200 times a day while I was at work. And naturally, I was answering these calls because she's giving me updates at the hospital. As soon as I was off work, I was going straight to the hospital, and this is where we spent our days for those 5 months. I was answering for those updates. I wanted to know what was happening, and the employers did not care about that at all. In fact, they fired me, and each time was the same. I brought it to their attention. You know, I have a child that I believe is probably going to die, and I need those phone calls, you know, and they cold-hearted, callously fired me, and that is the truth, and that is my opinion. But at that point, I lost everything. I lost my house, I lost my car, I lost everything that was at the time of any importance to me, and things that you need as a father and a husband, and I had nothing. And so we went on that escapade for 5 months, and with God and some luck, that child survived. That child, and the truth be told, I always told my wife during this time, because I wanted to be supportive, but in my mind, that child was not going to make it. The statistics show clearly what happens when things like this take place at such a young age. And I would tell her it was going to be okay, even though I thought in my mind that it probably wasn't. I mean, I just felt like I knew that this was insurmountable odds and that child was not going to make it. But the child lived, and when that took place, I realized I had lost everything, but I didn't necessarily care anymore. I realized what was really important for me, that you know, we could rebuild, is what I thought. So I was homeless in Charlotte, and I was seeking help, and the reality is there was none available. I went online, I did everything I could. If there was help available, I was unable to find it. Nevertheless, I did everything I could, no help at all for anybody in that position. I had to get back to work. I was homeless in Charlotte. My wife and children went to stay with her mother in South Carolina, and I had nowhere to live. And instead of holding a sign up asking for money, for me in my particular situation, I knew that this was not going to work. So I did the only thing I could do, and I started working again. And I was pretty much sleeping behind the buildings that I was working in, and I wasn't making any real money or anything substantial to build any kind of foundation back. And I got an opportunity to work in California for a contracting job in the military. And I decided to take what little bit of money I had and buy a ticket there. If I was homeless in Charlotte, I might as well be homeless making a lot more in California. And through this, I found tremendous success. When I got there, I worked 8 hours a day, and I made quite a bit more money than I ever would have on the East Coast in that position. I was able to get 2 other jobs. I worked 3 jobs with no home. I slept behind the places where I worked. I remember people actually would laugh at me because I smelled, you know, and I never gave the courtesy to explain to any individual, I'm not from the West Coast, I'm not from California, I don't know these people, but I have to find a way to make it. And I remember people laughing at me because of how I smelled. Nevertheless, it actually was a lot faster of a process than I thought. It took 3 to 4 months of working 3 jobs in California to make the necessary funds to get a home. And we found a house in Hope Mills, a place that we didn't even know existed. I had no idea it was near Fort Bragg when I got the house. But we used the funds that I got, and we moved back into a house in Hope Mills, at which time I realized I made a terrible mistake, because through all the escapades and all the nonsense, I come to realize when I arrived in Hope Mills that I had to get a job, something I just hadn't thought of. I was just so happy to have made it back on my feet. And I realized that I wasn't going to be able to do the same thing that I used to do. If I worked at Walmart, if I worked at Target, I wouldn't make it. It would take one life problem, really, to lose everything again. And at the same time, I had an opportunity from the VA to go to school for HVAC. I did at some point have a job with HVAC in the past because I met the homeowner who felt sorry for me in that current situation, but he wouldn't let me do anything of value. So I really had to learn. I took them up on it, and I took the class for HVAC with the VA. They gave me my own tools. They really helped me out. And I actually exceeded my own expectations with it. Now, current day, as I stand here before you now, on paper, I can say with confidence, for a lack of better words, I'm a refrigerant expert. On paper, documented. And in real life, as to not sound too conceited about it, even though I'm extremely proud of what I've accomplished, I'm very reasonable at my job. And I don't think there's too many things that can be thrown at me that I can't figure out or take care of. And that's really important. I've built a foundation, you know. Since I've been here in Hope Mills, I went to a program called Balm and Gilead. And in fact, if it wasn't for Balm and Gilead, I would have really struggled when I first moved into Hope Mills. They provided us with diapers and food and a whole number of other things that I can't even recall at the moment. But a really wonderful program. I believe the United Way funds them in some way. And Fayetteville Urban Ministries, I guess is what they're called. But for me now, I think it's important that I give back to programs that help others. And I also think it's important that others give to programs that help others, because although there are some scenarios where people have nothing because of decisions that they've made, there are a fair group of people out there that really need help for reasonable reasons. And without these programs, they likely will not make it. So I contribute, I encourage others to contribute to any program that helps others, in particular the United Way. But with that being said, I'll let you enjoy the rest of your meals and whatnot.